Hello, my name is Sandra Thiederman, and I'm going to be speaking with you for about the next 15 minutes or so about how to manage unconscious bias. Before we get into that material, though, I'd like to ask you one question. Do any of these statements seem familiar to you? All French people are good cooks. Southern Californians are flaky. New Yorkers are loud. Heavy people are lazy. Gay men are artistic, and teenagers are obsessed with texting. They do seem kind of silly when they're written out like that, don't they? But have any of these thoughts ever flitted through your brain from time to time? I know they have mine. And if so, welcome to the world of bias. Biases now, remember, don't make us bad people. That's certainly good news for most of us because most of us have them. But we do need to do something about them. So let's begin by taking a look at just what a bias is. A bias is an inflexible, positive or negative, conscious or unconscious belief about the characteristics of a particular category of people. Basically, what all that says is that a bias is an inflexible idea that we get in our head about what a particular person is like based on the group to which they belong. Hence, we end up with statements like, all French people are good cooks. And sure, some French people are good cooks, but a bunch aren't. And that's where the problem begins. How can we tell who a person really is and what they have to offer if we can't see them for their individual characteristics, if we are solely looking at them because of the group to which they belong? Biases, you see, distort our vision. They keep us from seeing people accurately. Just like the driver of this car, who because of the rain on the windshield is unable to see clearly in front of her, our biases blur our ability to know who a person is, what their needs are, and what they're good at. And because our view is distorted, we make bad decisions about whom to hire, whom to promote, and how to treat members of our teams with respect. So, how will this program help you reduce biases in your workplace? It's going to help you by covering three basic topics. First, we're going to talk about how to become aware of your biases. Then, we're going to take a look at why identifying what we have in common is in fact a really effective way to reduce bias. And finally, we're going to talk about three strategies for cultivating common ground. Now, of course, in 15 minutes, we can't possibly scratch the surface of a topic as complex as this. So what I've done is attach some materials to this presentation. You can see them, I believe, over to the left of your screen that will help you out. There's 3 articles there that deal with different aspects of bias, and then there's a link to a site that contains 6 short videos that cover various permutations about this subject. More about what a bias is, more about the challenges that biases create in the workplace, and again, most importantly, more material on how we can defeat our biases. So, let's get started. Bias awareness is clearly our first step, and there's lots of ways to become aware of our biases. There's, for example, what's called the Harvard Implicit Association Test. I'm not going to be dealing with that here because it's sort of beyond the scope of what we're talking about right now, but I did want to give you the link in case you need it. This is where you can find it. It's an interesting way to become aware of our biases. But here, I'd like to offer another approach, and it's a technique that's a bit more straightforward than the IAT, and in my view, the real beauty of it is it's utterly portable, and no computers are needed, and it's ideal for sharing with your team. And that technique is to notice the first thought that comes to mind when encountering a member of a group different from your own. You meet someone. You see the color of their skin, the fact that they use a wheelchair, the shape of their eye, maybe the way they're dressed, and most of the time, some thought, some assumption pops into your head about what they're like, about what they're good at, and about what they need. That first thought amounts to a clue, sort of a puff of smoke wafting up from what might be a hidden bias. Think of it as trace evidence of a bias. And although this watching of our thoughts is a straightforward technique, most of us aren't very used to it. Usually we just think what we do and the thought just kind of floats away and we're not even aware we ever had it. And most of the time that's okay. But when it comes to uncovering bias, we need to get into the habit, and that's what it really is, of noticing those first thoughts and those first assumptions. That's the only way we're going to be able to track those biases down. So to help you build that habit, I'm going to take you through a quick practice session. And as I do this, I'd like you to keep in mind how this activity might be employed with your team, and feel free to use it to help surface the biases that might be held in your workplace. I've constructed here a list of groups. They'll be popping up in just a minute. And I'm going to pull each group up and allow, a second or so in between them to give you a chance to watch what comes into your mind. So, let's see what happens. It doesn't really matter, by the way, what your first response is in this situation. This time around, I'm less after real biases and mostly just want you to get in the habit of watching what's coming to your mind. In another situation, when we're together, we'd be able to debrief what you come up with, and then we can begin to take it a little bit deeper. But right now, we're simply after helping you understand the process. So, here we go. What is the first thought that comes to your brain when I pull up each of these groups? A person who uses a wheelchair, a 24-year-old just out of college, a homeless person, a person who smokes cigarettes, and a single mother with 3 children. Now, if we were together or on a webinar or something, I'd ask someone to volunteer what came up. But for now, I'd like you to just remember what this process felt like and think about what you came up with. It might be providing you with some interesting clues to the biases that you might have. Also, I'd like to encourage you to continue developing this habit with this simple follow-up activity. Over the next couple of weeks, practice identifying the first thought, the first assumption that comes to mind when encountering someone different from yourself. You may find this in the workplace. It might be when you're walking down the street, but stay aware of it. Absolutely amazing what you'll begin to uncover. Okay, now that we have a way to identify our biases, what can we do about them? There are many strategies for reducing bias, but the cultivation and identification of what we, as human beings, have in common is, in my view, the single most important approach. Now, I want to make this really, really clear. I am not for one moment suggesting that we don't continue to value difference. In my view, if we do that, what's the point of all this effort? What I'm saying is that it's possible for us to, at the exact same moment, value differences while we're cultivating common ground. I kind of think of this as two sides of the diversity inclusion coin that you see here. Differences on one side, commonalities on the other. We need them both if we're to succeed. So, here's the question. How does identifying common ground reduce bias? Once we identify common ground, we automatically think of those who share that ground with us as us, rather than as an us and them. That may sound kind of vague to you right this second, but let me give you an example to which I think most of us can relate. Here we have 2 circles. Each circle represents a group that might have a bias and an inflexible belief about the other group. In this case, those groups are dog lovers and cat lovers. Here's a little extra to help amplify this point. Now, many of you don't fall in either of these groups, but I've found that an awful lot of people do, and there tends to be playful biases between us. These 2 circles represent, in this case, these rather silly categories of dog lover and cat lover, but they could just as easily represent native-born Americans and immigrants, white people and black people, men and women, traditionalist generation and millennials, Muslims and Christians, just about any category of difference you can think of. In this illustration, they are obviously separate, two entirely different groups with an emphasis on how the groups are different, not with an emphasis on how they are alike. Now, let's take this a step further. But what happens when members of diverse groups find a way to focus not only on how they differ, but also on what they share? This slide shows you the answer. They create, as you can see, in essence, a third group. Of course, the original groups and identities still exist, and that's great. But there's also this place of usness and common ground of animal lovers, and that's what we're after. And biases, by the way, and this is great news, have an awful lot of difficulty surviving in the soil of common ground. And why is that? Because when we focus on common ground, on being animal lovers together and not dog and cat lovers separately, we give less attention to the element that made us different. Whether that element is race or gender, age, sexual orientation, it doesn't matter. And in turn, we give less attention to the inflexible characteristic, the bias, that we link to that difference in the first place. Fundamentally, we've simply shifted our focus from difference to commonality. And that's the trick. How can we bring all this focus shifting and usness about? 3 ways. First, keep what we share top of mind. We notice what we care about. Think about this for a moment. Can you recall the last time you decided to buy a new car? Do you remember that as soon as you decided on the brand, model, and color, you started seeing those cars everywhere? That's a great example of what we call saliency determination, the ability to notice what is, to us, most important. In this case, that most important is common ground. I urge you in your workplace to, yes, of course, continue to value diversity, but at the same time, find ways to emphasize and facilitate what the diverse members of your team and your community have in common. Strategy 2, develop intergroup employee resource groups. Now, employee resource groups, or ERGs, have been traditionally developed around lines of gender, sexual orientation, ethnicity, race, national origin, which is great. But recently, many companies are beginning to encourage the formation of groups based not only on these traditional categories, but also on shared interests and needs. Here's just a few examples for you. Those that share elder care needs, for example. Team members that have adopted children. People who have particular disabilities, vets returning, part-time workers, flex-time workers, military reservists. I mean, the options are endless. Obviously, these types of groups, each of them, will be filled with people of very different backgrounds, different race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and they will have been brought together around some shared agenda, some common interest. So in short, the ERG, these new types, become their common ground, a common ground that, as we've seen, is very inhospitable to the growth of bias. Finally, facilitate intergroup contact. Now, that's not just any kind of contact. Many studies have shown that there is a particular characteristics that go along with the type of contact that has the greatest value in creating common ground and in turn reducing bias. There are several that are talked about, but these are the ones that seem to rise to the surface most often. That contact needs to be unhurried to some reasonable extent. It needs to be appropriately intimate. The people, as they get together, need to be interacting in some way, as long as, of course, it's appropriate. It needs to be varied among different people under different circumstances. It needs to be goal-oriented. For example, you can take a look at the folks in this picture.